They're strange thing, tally charts. A Marvel fanfiction. Summary in the description. Clint. Clint was responsible for the tally chart proudly displayed on the kitchen fridge, a half-doodled A3 sheet of paper displaying the results of their continuous prank wars. Every time one of the team one-upped another member, they got a mark next to their tally chart. It was childish, sure, but the Avengers deserved some reality. They were like typical college roommates underneath their costumes and all that. Natasha had no marks, stating that she had no time for such juvenile activities. Clint had 14 marks, some of which may have been snuck on so that he was ahead of Stark. He was the one who had written it after all. Tony, 12, Bruce, 3, and Thor had 2. He argued that he should have at least 9, but the others insisted that eating all the Pop-Tarts in the tower didn't count as a prank. It was just impolite and in bad taste. Steve, of course, usually didn't have time for such things, agreeing with Natasha that pranks were juvenile. However, he did have 6 marks and had been chuckling along with the rest of the team when he replaced Tony's favorite cup of pot with a teapot shaped like Mrs. Potts from Beauty and the Beast. Trust Steve to love a romantic fairy tale full of chivalry and teamwork, not to mention the fact that he was the one who filled Bruce's lab with balloons on his birthday. Clint swore that he was going to win the prank war no matter what. What he didn't realize was that Tony had set up booby traps along the vents around his lab, waiting for the next time Clint tried to sneak up on him when he was busy inventing. Thor. Thor has never written a tally chart. He sees no use for such a time-consuming Midgardian concept, for there are far more advanced ways of keeping track of numbers back in Asgard. He was a god and above such things. However, he was always full of childish glee and wonder when Clint placed a rarely earned line on his section of the prank war communal tally chart. Forget Loki, Thor should have been the trickster. Steve. Steve wasn't really one for tally charts either, although he took one for the team and resigned himself to filling out the other Avengers' paperwork. He really wasn't one for numeracy. Education in the 40s was nothing like it was now, and although he had grasped the basic concept of numeracy, he had no time for algebra, graphs, and statistical analysis. However, when the Avengers were going through their weekly argument about what film to watch during movie night on Friday, he had written down everyone's suggestions in a table. Then every week, he would ask people to place their votes for this week's film in the colored pencil of the week. They were not allowed to vote for their own movie suggestion, of course, a rule that Clint often ignored. This worked quite well and allowed them to avoid arguments on the whole, and it halted Tony's constant snarky comments about him using Tony's money to buy kiddie pencils for his coloring books. Stephen really had had enough of informing Tony that they were not kiddie pencils, but artist-grade watercolor pencils. But that was another argument. Natasha. Natasha had always been one for strategy, and had a penchant for numbers that rivaled Bruce's. She kept a mental tally of her kill list in regards to the bad guys that she had offed, and she was always happy to lord it over Clint that she had a higher percentage of one-shot kills than he did. Of course, Clint argued black and blue that her calculations were incorrect, although he was always silenced by one of her trademark death glares. He knew that if he argued with her, castration would be a likely end result. Although to be on the safe side, she would have to start writing her kills down on an actual tally chart in the back of her diary, just so she can prove him wrong and shut him up once and for all. Tony. Tony used tally charts for a darker reason than the others, as a form of self-harm and control. His entire body was crisscrossed with thousands of cuts, each half an inch long. Each set of 5 tally marks was separated from the next just by 5 millimeters of milk-white skin, or puffy red skin depending on whether that particular area of cuts was fresh or old. It had all started out by accident. Well, not exactly by accident, but Tony hadn't had an intention of cutting charts all over his skin. Not to begin with. It had all began with 15 cuts in a row, which he had gouged out of his stomach. They were only small as it took a lot of courage and determination to go through with deliberately harming yourself. Usually Tony did his best to avoid pain, But he bit his lip and dug the blade as deep as he could, letting out a small whimper as yellow fat tissue and red muscle appear beneath his flesh, immediately drowned out by a pool of crimson blood. Once he had made the first cut, the next 14 had followed relatively easy, some shallower than others, but still enough to hurt. See, the cuts represented the innocent lives that had died that day, due to Tony's failures. Jarvis had warned him that a doombot was approaching a nearby cafe, and also an art gallery full of schoolchildren. Tony had made the only choice he possibly could. He shot his repulsors and managed to redirect the bot away from the gallery. It had been just enough to change its trajectory marginally. The doombot hit the cafe instead. The public had heralded him a hero, praising him for his quick thinking and for saving the children. Hysterical mothers and fathers were releasing TV interviews thanking Iron Man for protecting their loved ones. That didn't make up for the fact that 2 elderly couples, 5 businessmen and women, 4 waitresses, and a pregnant woman had died instead. Tony made a cut for each of them. The one of the murdered fetus, the deepest cut of them all. They were penance in a way. He didn't want their lives to go unforgotten, or to carry on unpunished for killing 15 people. Yes, he had saved 40 kids, but who was he to play God and decide 15 other civilians didn't deserve to live? Tony had cried himself to sleep that night, drowning himself in a bottle when the burning pain from his cuts became too much. He knew that he deserved the pain, but that didn't stop the fact that the cuts were stinging and prickling uncomfortably. He was too weak to go through with it, and blacking out was the next best thing. The next time Tony had cut, it had been 2 times. A young couple on their honeymoon in New York had been collateral. The 2 cuts didn't seem enough to make up for the loss of young lives, so Tony had spent hours looking into how many people had died due to him over all the Avenger missions. It turned out that there were a lot. Over 600, actually. These deaths had been taken over a long period of time, admittedly, and many would have said that the deaths were not the Avengers' fault, but were down to the various supervillains trying to take out New York and various other cities. Tony didn't see it that way. By the time that he was done carving out 120 sets of tallies, which, coincidentally, had taken him all night, he was a shaking, hysterical mess. He would have got it done quicker, but he had passed out at least 3 times from the pain, and the blood loss was making his hand shake so violently that he kept losing his grip on his penknife. After that, Tony had purchased a small set of scalpel blades, the type that came in a small tub for artists to use when paper cutting or card making. They were easy to grip and more convenient. Every time the blades were dull from overuse, he was safe in the knowledge that there would be at least a few blades in the pack. The packs were travel size, and he could easily sneak them in a pocket or even inside his jeans or under his suit. Convenience was key, especially when the need to cut arose swiftly after a failed mission. He even stashed a few spare blades in the cistern of one of the communal toilets in the Quinjet. You know, just in case. Things escalated quickly from there. Soon his entire side was covered with cuts, without a single inch of unbroken skin, so he had to move on to his sides. After that, it was his hips, then his thighs, then his shoulders and the top of his arms. Tony was always careful not to cut anywhere that could be visible if he wore trousers or a short-sleeved t-shirt, but he was beginning to run out of space. And what made matters worse was that he knew that there should be more marks on his body. He deserved more pain, to cut himself more. He had only been able to cut for the people he knew had died due to him. But realistically, Tony knew that there had been thousands more, maybe even hundreds of thousands who had died at his hands from the weapons he had created. For the first time, Tony wondered if what he was doing was enough. Maybe next time, he would go for one cut, a deep one, running all the way down his arm, severing veins and arteries so that he would bleed out once and for all. It would be no less than he deserved. Tony pushed that thought aside and turned back to his new arrows he was developing for Clint. He needed to keep busy, to do something useful. It was the least he could do. Once Tony's calves, ankles, feet, and shoulders had been covered, Tony was reduced to a whole new time low. The first cut to his penis had almost made him blank out from the pain, but by the time he had sliced 12 tally marks that he had earned along his length, a sweet sense of satisfaction took over. He deserved the agony. This was closely followed by 7 cuts to his balls. Tony really did black out that time. The mission had been a nightmare. Each of the Avengers had returned to the tower battered, dejected, and exhausted. Once again, they had all been able to save the day, along with the fire and other emergency services. But their stupid vengeful villain of the week had managed to kill 30 people before Tony had been able to reach the scene in his suit and save the day. 30. That was 6 more sets of 5. Tony was curled up against the headboard of his bed, frantically scouring his bed for any area that wasn't already scarred. He had a rule that he wouldn't cut over existing scars, which would be disrespectful to the dead they represented. The problem was that there wasn't enough room on his body to make the required cuts. Only a few areas of skin remained unblemished, and they would all be visible if Tony wore a long-sleeved shirt. He had long since given up on the short-sleeved t-shirt rule. There was simply too much blood on his hands. Tony really was the merchant of death that the media branded him as. When asked, he had insisted that the old age was creeping up on him and that he was feeling cold more than usual. It was enough to stop the constant questioning about why Tony walked around his centrally heated tower in long-sleeved t-shirts and jumpers. Whenever one of the team pointed out that he was sweating due to the many layers he was wearing, he simply snarked at them and pointed out that he could wear whatever he damn pleased in his own tower. But now, the only available areas were his hands, his face, and his neck. Even his back had been slashed to pieces now. The cuts there were wonky due to the area being hard to reach, each with the use of a mirror, but the exquisite pain of cutting the sensitive flesh over his spine was worth it. Tony let out a cry of anguish when he realized that he simply couldn't be able to cut this time. The team couldn't find out. The idea was paralyzing, crippling in its intensity. He always been able to cut when the need arose, and Tony found himself beginning to hyperventilate as fear bore down on him. He was a failure, a pathetic waste of space who deserved nothing but pain, pain, pain. Tony screwed his eyes tight shut and leaned forward, curling himself into a tight ball and drawing in 2 quick, sharp breaths. He could not cut. He couldn't. That was it. Tony was going to kill himself. It was the only option left. With a sigh, he ordered Jarvis to switch off all the cameras and security feeds in the room. His AI didn't need to see this, and he didn't want the rest of the team to view the footage of him ending his pathetic life. They didn't deserve any more trauma in their lives. Tony had already installed a self-harm protocol into Jarvis, which automatically muted him and stopped him from informing the other Avengers of Tony's actions. But he never planned for this. No matter how disgusted he was with himself, Tony had never really been suicidal. Not very often, anyway. It seemed that the time had come, though. But first, Tony would drown himself in whiskey and vodka until the pain stopped, and it became easier to slip away. He'd slice his arms until the agony came to an end and his body simply couldn't take any more. Tony can see the headlines now. Infamous mass murderer Tony Stark atones for his sins. Suicide exclusive. Tony was stark naked, running his fingers over his raised scars, a fifth of the way through his second bottle. It had taken him half an hour to work up the nerve to do it. Pathetic. Bracing himself, he made a 5-long gash up his arm, cutting through layers of flesh, muscle, and fat. Tony only paused when his bedroom door swung to reveal Clint, Bruce, and Steve. He'd forgotten to lock the door. He couldn't do anything right. Even committing suicide in peace was beyond him. Some genius, huh? Hey, Tone, it's time for game night. You promised you'd join us this time. Shit, Tony! Clint was first to react, sprinting forward and grabbing the knife Tony was using out of his hands. Tony scrambled frantically at the archer, desperately trying to claw back his own lifeline, or deathline. Whatever, like it mattered. Tony was beyond semantics right now. No, please, I need... It's okay, Tony, it's okay. We're here now, we got you. Shh, it's okay. Bruce was talking to him in the calmest voice he possessed, pressing a cloth to Tony's arm and applying enough pressure to make it impossible to get away. No, stop, please, Bruce, I need to... Tony was cut off by another hitching sob, and he startled weakly as Steve pulled him into his arms, rocking him and crying into his shoulder. Why on earth was Cap crying? Couldn't he see this was for the best? That this was what Tony deserved? Tony, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm here now. I'm here. I'll help you get through this. We all will. Steve cried into his curly hair, kissing his forehead gently and massaging Tony's shoulders as Bruce set to work applying strips to the deep gash in Tony's arm. He'd cut so deep he could barely feel it, the nerves damaged beyond repair. No, please, I need to. I have to do this. I can't cut anymore. I can't. It's so bad. There's not enough room. There'll never be enough room. I've killed too many people. Can't you see? Tony was crying hysterically now, his words jumbled as he began to lose consciousness. No, Tony, you haven't killed anyone. It wasn't your fault. Shh. It's okay now. You don't have to punish yourself anymore, Clint said, rubbing Tony's back now that he had disposed of the knife. I can't. I can't. You don't understand. There's not enough room. Tony pulled away from everyone's grip, knowing that he didn't deserve their comfort. He was beyond hysterical. He was rocking uncontrollably now, tearing brutally at his hair as he sobbed, and half screamed into the crook of his arm and over his knees. What am I gonna do? I need more room. I need to cut. I need to! Tony's breaths were coming in frantic gasps, and he let out a hollow of desperation that made Clint physically recoil. The archer knelt down next to Tony, scooping the sobbing man into his chest and rocking with him, stroking soft yet firm circles into his back, as Steve took his other side, both men cradling him in their arms. It's okay, Tony. You don't have to punish yourself anymore. You've done enough already. You don't deserve to be punished any more than the rest of us do. None of this was your fault. Come on, let me clean you up. You're going into shock. I've got you, Tony. You're safe now. It wasn't your fault. Bruce finished bandaging Tony's arm before the genius could really realize what he was doing. Tears were streaming down the scientist's face as he finished up, watching Clint's uncharacteristically gentle movements as he cradled Stark. Bruce was no stranger to self-loathing, and he knew that Tony was going to need help and lots of love and reassurances. The idea that his friend had been hurting for so long tore him apart. How had they missed this? It was with a heavy heart that he left the room and began making some calls. He started by setting up a counseling session for Tony with his own therapist. The team could take it from there. Steve and Clint stayed with Tony all night, mumbling reassurances into Tony's hair and stroking his back as he threw up and trembled, expelling the alcohol that he had previously consumed. Once Tony was done, they cleaned him up, coaxed him into drinking some water, and gingerly laid him down into his bed, both men acting as Tony's big spoon and protecting him from himself. Tony slept the best he had in weeks, wondering for a brief second if they were right. What if he had punished himself enough? The next morning, Tony woke up to the smell of freshly ground coffee, and the tiniest flicker of a smile ghosted across his lips as he accepted the mug that Clint was handing him. He was still cradled in Steve's arms, and he allowed himself to be comforted for the first time in a long time, burying his face in the super soldier's chest and nuzzling him. Whenever his hand reached out to his bandaged arm, Steve would bat it away gently, seemingly realizing that Tony was feeling the urge to cut again, or to dig at the newest wound and hurt himself more. He stayed with Tony all day, allowing the genius to cry himself into fitful bouts of sleep, until eventually Tony seemed to come around, excusing himself to shower and clean himself up. It was a good sign, if nothing else. Bruce admired his handiwork with a proud sigh of relief. He stood up and tucked a leather-bound notebook under his arms, making his way over to the elevator. Hey Jay, can I hitch a ride to Tony's lab? Of course, Dr. Banner, my pleasure. Bruce was apprehensive, tapping his fingers against the railings in the radiator, as he wondered whether he made the right decision in doing this for his friend. But there was no going back now. Not after he had poured so many hours into the book, both in terms of writing and the background research for it. He was a scientist, methodical and good at research, but that didn't mean that looking up every life that Tony had saved on their archives and in the news didn't take a lot of time. A lot of time. But in Bruce's opinion, it was time well spent. He had spent 5 sleepless caffeine-filled nights a la Stark, poring over his tablet, going over their records. Each page of the notebook had been filled with a date, or many dates depending on the page, a set of tally marks and a brief description of events where Tony had saved a life. Over 3/4 of the book was full with Bruce's tiny trademark scrawl. There were hundreds of tally marks per page. Only one of the tally marks had been given a name tag, though, beyond a location, and a brief description of what the life-threatening event had involved. It read, Bruce Banner. I don't know if you will remember this, Tony, but you saved my life one night. It was after I hulked out, and I nearly killed Nat. I was in a dark place that night, Tony. The idea that I could hurt Nat was too much for me to bear. I had a gun in my hand, in the lab, and I was about to do it when you walked in and just chatted to me. I think you knew that I needed someone to be there for me to talk to, a distraction. I was worried that you saw me sneak the gun back into its drawer, but you never said anything. I guess what I'm trying to say is that yes, your weapons may have caused a lot of deaths, and as a team, we have a hell of a lot of collateral to pay for one day. But the responsibility does not rest on your shoulders. You're a great guy, Tony, a hero. The only one who cannot see that is you. So I have started this book to show you that the people you have saved are worth a tally mark as well. Just not a cut one, okay? You can carry it on from here. I'm sure you'll fill this book in no time. Let me know if you need a second notebook. Love, Bruce. When Tony had read the note for the first time, Bruce handing it to him with a small smile, accompanied by a brief hug. He had cried for a solid hour. But they were happy tears, so Tony didn't mind. Tony Mark II. Tony smiled, nibbling at the tip of his biro absently. He'd just drawn 3 sets of 5 tallies in his notebook, hands still shaking from the adrenaline high produced from the last mission. It felt surreal, coming back from an assemble, and turning to a pen instead of his usual set of razors, blades, and penknives. But he had to admit that this was a distinct improvement. With the help of his suit, Tony had been able to airily support his team, and had single-handedly floored a ginormous robotic duck. Don't ask. Before it had the chance to take out the 15 locals enjoying an afternoon coffee in the cafe below. Even Tony had to admit that a coffee fix wasn't worth dying for, although it was a close call. Tony closed the book and placed it on his desk, stroking its cover fondly as he stretched out his back, rolled his shoulders, and took a deep sip of his own coffee. The cafe owner he saved had offered Tony a lifetime supply of coffee from his cafe, as if Tony couldn't pay for himself. Tony hadn't had the heart to decline, though, and was sipping from his takeaway cup. The man's gratitude had been humbling, especially when he told Tony how thankful he was that he'd been able to return to his husband and kids when he got home. It wasn't just his life he had saved, it was theirs as well, in a way. For the first time in a long time, he realized that everything was going to be all right from now on. He hadn't felt the urge to cut in over a week.